Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today on The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop, my bookshop in Eagleview. Today, our guest is Owen Whooley, author of On the Heels of Ignorance, Psychiatry and the Politics of Not Knowing. Originally published in 2019 by the University of Chicago Press, it was the winner of the 2020 Robert K. Merton Outstanding Book Award from the American Sociology Association. And his previous work includes, among others, Knowledge in the Time of Cholera, the Struggle Over American Medicine in the 19th Century, which won the same award back in 2015, I think. Owen is associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of New Mexico. So, On the Heels of Ignorance is not necessarily a screed on the professional or the standards maintained by psychiatry, specifically with a nod or shaking of the head at the DSM-5. Owen feels as if the history of American psychiatry is mired in ignorance, and believe me, he makes no bones about it. He finds it curious, dramatic in its changeable precepts, subsumed by crisis after crisis, filled with faddish theories. The book begins with a simple premise. The history of American psychiatry is a history of ignorance. Underwriting its curious past are dramatic transformations, faddish and epistemological gymnastics, arrogance, humblings, abuses. These are his words. He feels as if psychiatrists lack basic knowledge about their own profession and its tenets. And in the book, he wonders how the science, if you will, of medicine, if you will, has survived, notwithstanding its lacunae. And as he would want to say over and over again, it's ignorance. So welcome, Owen, and thanks so much for coming by today.
Thank you for having me.
So first, since I own an independent bookstore and your book is on the front table, as I said before we started, let's talk a little bit about what brings my customers, and you were one, to purchase a book. Everyone says you can't judge a book by its cover. Everybody who comes into my bookstore judges every book by its cover. So tell us a little bit about it. If you have it there, you can show it too.
Yeah, I do. This is the cover, a nice orange and white and black. So the cover is an image of what was called a tranquilizing chair. And it was a kind of early treatment in American psychiatry that was invented by Benjamin Rush, who is a native Philadelphian. Rush had this idea that mental illness or madness was some sort of arterial disease caused by inflammation in the brain, caused by overstimulation. And so he created this kind of tranquilizing chair in order to kind of calm the nerves of an individual. So the individual is kind of strapped onto a chair. He or she has this kind of box placed on their head, which is supposed to kind of cut off the peripheral vision. This chair also, so as it was a treatment, but also served as a kind of useful constraining device for bloodletting. So I don't know academic presses. I don't know how much discretion they give to authors over their cover. Certainly, my first book, I had almost no say in it. I will give a shout out to Chicago Press. I think they do a good job in this cover design. They take it seriously. A lot of academic presses, it looks like clip art kind of the design.
Yeah, I like the cover.
Yeah, and so they asked me for kind of a storyboard of various images. This was one of the many images, and I think the editor, who has passed away, Doug Mitchell, giant in sociology, he really honed in on this image as a kind of metaphor for both the kind of troubling history, perhaps one might say somewhat absurd history of psychiatry, but also if we think about perhaps the psychiatrist in the chair, the kind of tunnel vision that I argue often emerges in the course. So I was very happy with the cover.
Yeah, and like I said, publishers sometimes don't give the authors a lot of leeway because publishers want to sell books and they know how to put covers.
Yeah. I will say I didn't like the color. I thought I think at the time I was reading two books that also had an orange cover, and I thought, oh, are we just jumping on some sort of publishing trend here? But when I raised the objection, they said, no, we'll go with this cover. So
it does stand out on the table, definitely. Well, that goes to the next thing. So the customers who come in who know what they're doing and really are looking for something that they're going to enjoy, after the cover, they look at the title, and generally now, because every book has it, a subtitle. So if you look at the title of the book, On the Heels of Ignorance, it already sounds negative towards the topic you're going to be discussing. And then the subtitle is Psychiatry and the Politics of Not Knowing. So I guess if you're looking at the book, yeah, it sounds interesting and exciting, but the two words that are somewhat undefinable to a neophyte would be heels and politics. Yeah. So why don't you describe the entire title? Because that goes a long way towards what actually, and it should, what actually the book is about. Yeah.
I mean, I will say, and maybe I didn't achieve this, but it's, I wanted to write a book about psychiatric ignorance, and as soon as you mentioned the word ignorance, it kind of folds into, well, that's just going to be a kind of intense critique of psychiatry. I think I offer a kind of more nuanced account. Maybe that doesn't come through, and we can certainly talk about it. The title, On the Heels of Ignorance, is a play on a kind of famous saying that's often attributed to Isaac Newton. It actually wasn't Newton who first said it, but it's a laudatory saying for science. To paraphrase, I can see further because I stand upon the shoulders of giants. And so it's kind of a play on that. I like, unlike many social scientists, I like ambiguity. So the idea of heal, I think, is doing kind of multiple things, at least in my mind. I like to kind of envision psychiatry trying to kind of nipping at the heels of its ignorance, but never quite catching it. Heels also could have an even more negative component as a kind of, a heel as in a kind of incompetent person. But, I did struggle with, right, how do you kind of convey the essence of the critique in a way that isn't immediately off-putting to people who might not have that, share those critiques.
Well, the other word is, if someone looks at the politics word, they're going to think of it in terms of a governmental aspect, whereas it could mean simply a group or an organization. So in what way did you choose that word?
Politics to me, and I'm probably using a kind of very broad, kind of more social science, sociological account of politics and political power than we would typically think of in terms of kind of government and nation states. Originally, it was psychiatry and the professional politics of not knowing, but that became a lot of P's in one subtitle. So really what I'm interested is in the politics around, or the struggles and conflicts around knowledge disputes. So this really is a professional history. It's a particular kind of professional history, which I think we can get into later. But at the end of the day, to secure professional power, right, professions have to engage in politicking. And so I'm using it in a kind of very broad sense to kind of signal that this is about struggles over meaning.
Well, so the next, and I actually think this is a valuable exercise, because the next thing, again, erudite readers look at are the epigraphs, because they figure that the author must spend a lot of time deciding what those epigraphs would be, because it's like the outside of a jigsaw puzzle box. There's the picture, and inside you got to put it all together with all the pieces. So let's go to the two epigraphs and how you chose them, because they're both fascinating quotes that we all may have heard of before.
Yeah, so looking at them, and the first one is from Alfred North Whitehead, not ignorance, but the ignorance of ignorance is the death of knowledge. You know, one of the kind of aims of the book is to bring to the fore ignorance as a thing that forms an integral role in how we make sense of and adjudicate knowledge disputes. And so, you know, I have a kind of part of the introduction that kind of goes through these aphorisms around ignorance. But, you know, the reason I chose this one of those many aphorisms is the idea that, and this goes back all the way to Socrates, right? You know, that true knowledge comes from understanding the limits of one's knowledge. And I think all too often in the more egregious abuses of psychiatry, what we see is a kind of arrogance by which the limits of knowledge are not appreciated. And those can have a problematic effect if you're talking about the kind of progress of scientific knowledge. The other one is more tongue-in-cheek. So it's and this one, you know, you hear this one all the time. I was scrolling through my Twitter feed this morning and someone had said it around something. I don't remember what it was, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And I note that that's been attributed to Albert Einstein and Benjamin Franklin and Mark Twain and Narcotics Anonymous, probably 15 other people. So unknown for now, I put. This has to do with the reason I put this is as an epigraph is, psychiatry, as I kind of recounted this book, has kind of gone through these kind of constant reinventions, so much so that there's a kind of cyclical nature. I talk about in the book a kind of hype disappointment cycle that psychiatry undergoes. And so there's this kind of recurrent trying to address an underlying crisis in the same way. And one could argue that that's the kind of definition of insanity.
What I think could have been a third epigraph, and you actually do include it in the body of the book, is Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote, which is, we don't know what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know we don't know. And, at the time it was ridiculed as one of his semantic faux pas, but I always thought, well, yeah, this is well put. Surprisingly, being as left-wing as you can possibly be. Yeah, I thought there was, and you use it as a stepping off point.
Yes, I think I actually know why I didn't use that here, and I didn't want to give Donald Rumsfeld that kind of prominence in the book. Even quoting him in the body of the book was enough. So I didn't want, there's a whole lot of problematic associations that come with Donald Rumsfeld, and I didn't want to kind of put it out there that this book was endorsing him in any sort of way. But I agree. I agree. It's a very trenchant quote. It seems absurd and it seems cynical given the source, but it actually cuts at the heart of what many kind of sociologists of ignorance and philosophers of ignorance kind of understand as different kinds or forms of ignorance.
Well, so I guess that would be the next question is, and because I have downloaded this on the Kindle, I know that you use the word ignorance in your book 603 times. And you use the word psychiatrist so much that Kindle just says 1,000 plus because it lost count.
Yeah.
So I guess what we need to define is the word. And I'm looking at it the way many people might look at it, which is where our differences may arise. It's not good. It's benighted. It's being clueless. It's being incognizant. It's obliviousness, unawareness, unfamiliarity. And I read this quote that said, it's better to have honest nescience than to have militant ignorance. And then I thought to myself, okay, which way is he going here? Yeah. Especially when you go into the DSM-5, which you hate.
Hate is probably a strong word. Hate is, I have a very strong critique of the DSM, but I wouldn't go so far to, it's weird to hate a nosology.
I know,
Life
yeah,
is too short, but yeah.
I watched your YouTube video and when you had your notes with you, you exuded a certain contempt. I'm sorry, but you
Yes, yeah, well, fair enough, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to, you know, ignorance gets a bad rap, and we tend to associate ignorance with an absence, a lack, a state that of discomfort that we want to overcome, and it certainly can be that, right? But one of the things that I'm interested in is parsing out kind of different forms of ignorance, right? Ignorance can have many different sources and be motivated by different motivations. So for example, right, you can have strategic and useful ignorance. There are sociologists who talk about that, right? And those can have political functional uses. So, you know, if I'm a leader of a country that is doing really poorly during an epidemic, I might have an incentive to create a really inadequate testing infrastructure or reporting of infrastructure, right? So I keep the population, ignorance is the extent of the epidemic, if you will, in order to maintain my political power. Ignorance is also quite useful. I mean, if you think about science and the whole entire project of science, it's founded upon ignorance, right? What we don't know and how we can learn it, right? And,
well,
yeah.
I thought of three people, I guess. I thought of Thomas Edison, Einstein, and Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk loves failure. He loves when his boosters crash. He loves when they burn, because he was ignorant of what he needed to do to light the third Raptor on the descent. And Einstein, many quotes about the idea of failure and ignorance. And Edison going through 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration, and going through filament after filament. And then I went further back to alchemy. You would say those guys were ignorant. They were ignorant, but they gave us so much because the offshoots of what they did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would go farther and say, yes, they were ignorant, so I'm ignorant, right? And you're ignorant, right? I mean, I think part of I think the benefit, the kind of analytical payoff one gets when they shift from a focus on knowledge to ignorance is you start to realize that ignorance is everywhere, and we swim in its sea, and we are vastly more ignorant than we are knowing, right? I know a little corner of a universe based on my experience and my training, but there's a vastness of things that I encounter in my daily life that I'm ignorant about. And I don't, and some of that ignorance might be inexcusable, right? But most of it just is, right? And so I think, part of the challenge of this book is, is trying to push against two things. One, the knee-jerk reaction of ignorance is always bad, because we mentioned science, but you could go to a whole religious kind of mystical account of ignorance that views it as laudatory and something that gets one closer to God. So I'm pushing against the idea, the knee-jerk account, ignorance is bad and we need to overcome it. And I want to push against the fact that a tradition of writing about psychiatric history that I don't want to say is overly critical, but is, that is pretty intensely dismissive of the profession. Now, I may not get there, and I may skew that in that direction, but those are the kind of challenges that I'm struggling with.
Well, as I said earlier, and I'll admit that there's a lot of things in the book that I disagree with. One of them is when you say something like psychiatry starts out with a severe deficit. You say it as if it's axiomatic, but it's not. It's just something you're saying. I mean, there's no empirical. It's the idea. What you say is, convincing people that it's unknown but knowable. And then you go into this idea that they're elitist because they want to hide the fact from the populace, the ignorant masses, that they really can't do shit.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a conspiratorial reading of it that I wouldn't, and my apologies.
Just go to my first line. Why do you say psychiatry starts out with a severe deficit?
Because, one of the things I think to appreciate is how I came to this focus on ignorance. I didn't begin there. I'll be frank. This book started as a book on the history of psychiatric classifications, which snooze. But what I noticed in my research, going through the writings of psychiatry themselves, is that they are the ones attesting to their own ignorance and gaps in knowledge. And this I'm reading in contrast to my previous book, which is on the professionalization of kind of mainstream medicine, where in that discourse, you don't see a discussion of ignorance. So when you ask me where I came up with this idea that psychiatry starts with a deficit, I get it from psychiatrists. And this is both in the historical record, but also in the contemporary. If you talk to some psychiatrists, not all, they will say this.
Yeah, but in your acknowledgments, you say, it's a real backhanded compliment too. You say you talked to all these psychiatrists who told you about the opacity of their profession. Mm-hmm. I mean, why don't you say it about yours or brain surgeons?
Certainly. I mean, that's the problem. This is what I tell my students, right? The problem is, you write a book on one profession, right? But you could write a history of ignorance on any profession. Now, I think, and you certainly can write it about sociology, right? So that I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's just, one of the things I think makes distinct about psychiatry and their history of ignorance, and I don't want to say qualitatively distinct, I think this is present in all kind of knowledge producing endeavors, is one, as I mentioned, they talk an awful lot about ignorance. They struggle with how to make sense of their ignorance. And two, right, it is a beleaguered profession, or at least has been at various points in its history. So simultaneously, while psychiatrists are, acknowledging this ignorance, they're also facing very intensive external critiques. One might lump myself in there with them, that they are also pointing to these ignorance and gaps in knowledge. But before we get too kind of, go ahead. I'll go.
All right, I was just going to say this, and see if you can get yourself out of this one. Yeah. The idea is, I don't see anything in the book where maybe they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, or that there's any hope that they'll eventually have a foundation that's real and will actually help people on a day-to-day basis. I don't see that in there. Is it in there?
Is it in there? I do a common kind of sociologist, particularly sociology of science move, where I kind of punt on the ultimate standing as to the knowability of mental illness, right? So, I talk in the book how so much of kind of professional efforts within psychiatry is trying to convince people that while things in psychiatry are unknown today, they will be knowable in the future, right? That's the kind of basic dynamic. I don't know, right? I mean, I don't know. What I take umbrage at, if I do have a critique, is this recurrent pattern that you see in psychiatry in which someone says, we have a crisis of ignorance, I have the right way to figure it out, or mostly it's we have the right way to figure it out. And we need to focus all of our efforts into distilling the complexity of mental distress through this particular framework, right? There's a certain kind of unwon arrogance, I would say, to that kind of position, right? And I think we see it today, right? I think we see it with neuroscience. And I think neuroscience is promising. I think there's incredible insights coming out of that field, but we're crawling, right? We're not even walking in that field. We have the most rudimentary kind of understanding of how the brain works. Well, psychiatrists have kind of glommed on to neuroscience as the grand solution to their problem of ignorance putting the cart very, very much in front of the research horse while simultaneously rejecting other possible ways or other possible approaches to get to mental distress.
The funny thing is, when I listened to your talk in which you're talking about taxonomy and the kind of classification and nosology, the title of the talk was Through a Glass Darkly. And I go, okay, well, and that's from the Gospels, and then William Blake, and even Mick Jagger at the death of Brian Jones. But at least you're giving them a glass darkly. At least they can see something. All they need to do is take a cloth and wipe it away. And you talk about the looking glass kind of aspect of us, or like Alice, through the looking glass. And the idea there is, okay, it's nice of him to give the psychiatrist at least the fact that they might be able to see something, although very, very blurrily, not opaque.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would characterize my argument as not giving them any hope or any kind of, insight. I think it would be empirically false, historically false, to say psychiatry hasn't made any progress. I just take umbrage at the often reductionistic ways in which the profession tries to address what is really a very kind of complex
but who are you to say it's elitist, though? You say it's elitist, but how do you know it's elitist, and what gives you the right to say that? I could say
but I think I'm using elite I'm using elite in a particular term. I'm talking about psychiatric elites, right? So one of the distinctions I want to make it clear in this book is, in kind of drawing parameters over, what it is I study, I'm studying the discourse of elites who I deem kind of aspirational psychiatry. I take that from another historian. These are the people who are the public-facing leaders of the profession who are articulating to the public, to government entities, to health insurers, this is our expertise, right? In order to be clear that what this misses is the kind of on-the-ground practice of psychiatry, or at least that's not its kind of focus.
Okay, well, if we're talking on-the-ground psychiatry, have you ever been in therapy with a psychiatrist?
Yeah.
Okay, and so have I. And I found that when I am, it's general, you know how it is, you go to a psychiatrist, you don't like him the first time, you don't go back. But if you do like him and then he doesn't end up saying a word and you leave feeling exhausted, I feel like I've done a lot of hard work and it's helped me. And maybe I'm not necessarily doing it in order to cure a mental illness. I'm doing it as an experiment on myself. And I find that very useful. And I wouldn't look at that as ignorance on his part in the manner in which he's treating me as a patient.
Yeah, I guess what would be, so yes, indeed, exactly, right? I mean, I go to psychiatrists too, right? I've taken SSRIs, right? And I have deep ambivalence about the status of SSRIs, but at the end of the day, they work for me. Now, why do they work? We don't know, right? It could be a placebo effect. It could be a chemical, a kind of chemical imbalance of the brain. We don't know, right?
I'll give you, go ahead. Sorry.
So I think psychiatrists are grappling with complicated stuff. I think that's my firm belief. Probably more complicated than any branch of medicine, right? And good psychiatrists, I would venture to say, grapple with that complicated stuff. I think less good psychiatrists, do a kind of cookbook psychiatry based on the DSM, right? A kind of trial and error here, take this SSRI, if that doesn't work, we'll try you on another one,
Right.
So there are good psychiatrists. There's also really bad psychiatrists, just as there's, one of my psychiatrists kind of friends in kind of talking to him about this book, who also has objections. I like talking to psychiatrists because, there's a lot more at stake for them than me in terms of, the kind of claims in this book. But he says, oh, we kind of went back and forth over beers one night, and he kind of says, oh, so what you're saying is it's like Congress, right? Most people if you survey people, most people like their individual congressperson, but everybody universally hates Congress, right? So many people and many psychiatrists are wonderful at what they do. But the profession in itself, in terms of its kind of justification around its expertise, I think is on pretty unstable ground. And I don't think anyone can deny that historically has perpetrated really horrible abuses on people. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to run away from the idea that I am very critical of psychiatry, particularly historically. Right? I'm not going to apologize for that idea. And I think if you look at the duration of the profession, you see these kind of recurrent cycles of kind of crisis of ignorance, a kind of hype around some new reinvention of how we're now going to solve the problem of ignorance, an arrogance and a kind of myopia that comes with that. And then, let it play out for, a number of decades. And then we reach another crisis and we do the same thing over.
Look at the DSM-5, which you trash. You can say you don't, but I say you do, and I'm entitled to say that. So I say you trash it, and you make this chart saying now it's 947 pages and pushed all this stuff into it. Now it's 541 disorders. And Asperger's is no longer part of the autism, now it's part of the autism spectrum. It used to be a separate disorder with its own code number. Now, trichotillomania, for example, is lumped in with nail biting, but trichotillomania seemed as severe because people can see that. If you bite your nails, they're not going to see that. Now, I don't know if reading that helps me at all, but if you know someone who has trichotillomania, or if you have it, what is the DSM-5 doing there? It's classifying it as something, but it's not telling you how to stop it.
It's labeling as a mental disorder.
Right.
Right. And so
is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the diagnostic manual of mental disorders, right? It is, there are plenty of things that are not in that book that people advocate should be, right? It is the profession's official stamp of this is the universe of mental disorders that we recognize. Right?
What about the one about grief, going in and out, getting in and out? It is, it isn't. Why are you so pissed off about that?
I think you're mischaracterizing me as pissed off and angry, and I'm actually not pissed off or angry. I'm just critical, right? And I think that's an important distinction, because I don't think, and I would push back that, if you kind of read this book, this is not a screed, right? This is not, there are plenty of anti-psychiatry books out there, right? There's a whole industry around it. This is.
If you type the words psychiatry space ignorance in Google, the only thing that comes up is you. Try it. Page after page. You're the only answer in Google when you type those two words.
Maybe that speaks to kind of innovation. I don't know.
I'm not trying to yell at you. I'm just saying I'm the reader.
So here's my issue. You asked about the kind of bereavement exclusion from depression, right? And this is an argument I would make, many sociologists would make, is right. We are concerned about over medicalization, right? The taking of everyday problems, personal problems, and framing them as medical in nature and thus in need of a medical solution. Now, I would argue that the writers of the DSM, and I've spoken to many of them, are also worried about this, but not as worried. And the reason we know they're a little bit worried about this is previous additions to the DSM in the category of major depressive disorder carved out an exception for symptoms based on that are the result of a loss of a loved one, right? So at some point they drew a line and said, grief is excluded, right? If a patient shows up into your office and they talk about anhedonia, they talk about lack of appetite, inability to sleep, those kinds of things. But those symptoms are the result of the loss of their spouse. They are not mentally ill. Right? Now, what happens when you eliminate that exclusion? Well, in some sense, right? Not a grandiose sense, but in some sense, you are stigmatizing that grief as pathological in nature, that requires a medical intervention. Right? I would argue, both as a sociologist and as a kind of humanist, that that's problematic. Right?
It is. But a perfect example this week and last week is the Surfside condominium collapse, where you have first responders who have been there for a week. You have people who have lost their dogs who they love. And then you have the people who've lost their mothers, their grandmothers, their children, their brothers and sisters. I mean, yeah, it's a difficult subject, but should they get anti-anxiety? They should talk to someone. Are they entitled to have medication? Are they entitled to be allowed to have medication? Maybe it's not a major, what are we arguing about? Maybe it's not a medical disorder, but well, it's something.
I think we have to be appreciative of what the DSM categories are, right? Because we don't understand the underlying mechanisms of mental disorder, right? We don't understand the neurochemistry, chemical imbalance theories, widely discredited both, by critics of psychiatry, but also by psychiatric researchers themselves, right? So what the DSM is essentially for each category is a list of symptoms, right? Phenomenological symptoms that an individual experiences. Right? What's important to note is that exercise has a high degree of interpretation involved, right? These are categories that are developed by committees of 10 to 12 experts in the field who set up, thresholds, set up lists, right? There's a certain arbitrariness to that. Right? But when you transform that arbitrariness as this kind of very professional looking document with these kind of discrete categories, one of the things you're doing is you're putting your expertise and your imprimatur on that as a valid way of reading the world.
But okay, I'll give you an example. In your talk that I was referring to, what's the name of the university that you gave a talk to about Through the Glass Darkly? I've forgotten.
It's Western University in Canada.
Yeah. So you must have used the term paradigm shift, I would say 20 to 25 times.
Yeah.
You could say it's a big change. You could say they made a right turn. And this is a different way I'm yelling at you now. It's about something else.
Okay.
So you're in academia, so you have to say paradigm shift. It's like a lawyer says, and I'm a lawyer, you say at this juncture. At this juncture just means now. You could say now. So you're talking about a paradigm shift. It's just a term you use in order to fit yourself into the box of what you are. You could say it was a major change. You could say they made a 180-degree turn. You could say they were driving along and they just thought of something and they made a right turn. Those terms that you use, and there's tons of them, are the language you speak. But today we're talking about a book that you're selling that people who don't know those terms or don't use those terms are buying. And so I have a problem with that. I have the same kind of problem you have with certain aspects. Whatever it was that started me off on this, it was something about, the categorization and the taxonomy of the DSM-5. You do the same thing. You come up with these terms.
Yeah, there's a very technical reason why I don't use paradigm shift in this book. I'll put that aside. I use reinvention for
right.
But okay. So if I understand your argument is, just as psychiatry uses terms and definitions and operationalizes those in ways that I might not like, so too am I doing that, right? And I will say, yes, right? We are writers. Writers write in language that they feel like expresses their viewpoint. But I would also push back a little bit, because if you don't like the terms that I'm using, you put down my book. right?
No, well, yeah, that's true. I don't have to buy it. I don't have to watch
If I
a
don't
TV
like
show.
the terms that a psychiatrist is using, they have quite a bit more power, right? They can determine whether or not I get forcibly committed, right?
That's
And
true.
so the stakes of whose terms, the power of whose terms. Listen, I'm a sociologist. We have, this much power, right? And so, and maybe that's a shield for me to, I don't know, not take this stuff seriously. But the ramifications and stakes of psychiatric diagnostic language is far exceeds what a sociologist writes in a book. Right? There are real world implications to this.
But for you to say that I don't have to read your book, I think is unfair. The reason I read your book is because you're intelligent. Your book was fun to read. It was entertaining. I learned a lot. And why wouldn't I read your book? I can disagree with what you say.
Well, you put the book down, right?
No, I don't. Oh.
No, you physically put the book down, right? And you go about your life, right? I read plenty of books I don't agree with. They can be engaging. It sounds like you engaged with the book. You don't agree with it, but you find it kind of compelling enough to kind of, have a kind of, robust discussion about it, right? But at the end of the day, no one's life is at stake here, right? No one's health is at stake. No one's kind of legal status is at stake here. So I think the equating the use of paradigm shift with equating the kind of, DSM construction of a particular diagnostic categories, I feel like it's an unfair comparison.
Okay, well, you said you didn't use paradigm shift in this book. And I want, you used it 52 times in this book. And it's not fair for me doing this Kindle thing. But at this point, do you feel like you're getting angry at me?
No.
Are you agitated by what I'm saying?
Listen, no, I presented this work in front of psychiatrists.
I know.
And which is a generally hostile audience.
Yeah.
Not as hostile as I think you would think. But, so this is all part of, robust academic or, robust discourse, right? We should be able to disagree and have a back and forth. So I'm not angry. I will push back on some of the characterizations that I feel like are a little bit unfair, but I'm not particularly angry.
Well, another thing is whether I'm interviewing someone who's written a novel or someone who's written, I've interviewed like 5 guys for some reason and women who have discussed where they feel the seat of human consciousness is. And they're all different. It's exactly like you're saying. They're all different. And then I bring up to them, well, what if it's a solipsistic universe? And they all get really mad because that screws up their entire theory because one of us isn't talking to the other. And so I've angered many of them by saying that because it's like I interviewed this Nobel laureate who used to hang out with Richard Feynman. And I said, why isn't 1 a prime number? And he goes, because it wouldn't be convenient.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that was ignorance or not. But what I was getting at was when I interview a novelist or someone, at the end of the book, I don't necessarily want it wrapped up, gift wrapped. I like the idea of leaving the book and thinking. I did with your book tremendously. That's why I'm talking the way I am. I put it down and I thought about it. I wrote stuff about it. So that's what I'm looking for in a book.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the objective in the book, right? I mean, I think, what the intervention is here is trying to think about the history of psychiatry from a different angle, in an effort, and maybe I didn't achieve this effort, but in an effort to kind of get past this. Either we write heroic accounts of psychiatry or we write anti-psychiatry screeds. Right? I wanted to try to carve out some nuance in between those two things. I think the worst thing is, the worst thing is no one reads the book. The second worst thing is someone reads the book and says, that's not worth the paper it's written on. The third worst thing is, I agree with everything you said. I have nothing to say to you, right? So, this is the, ideal. I want, students, scholars to push back on this, and they have, right? And I knew they would, right? My previous book was about cholera, right? No one's particularly politically charged around cholera today, right? I wrote about his psychiatry knowing full well that I was entering a maelstrom, right? And I was entering an arena where people have very strong feelings. And so the psychiatrists have very strong feelings. I have to say, there's a whole other side that we haven't talked about, which we might label under anti-psychiatry, that have very strong feelings about what I write here, in that I'm too sympathetic to psychiatrists. Now, I don't know, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it's still, I was talking to one of the young women who work in my bookstore. She's going to Bucknell. Northwestern. And we were talking about the stigmatization of that. There is still a stigma if you tell somebody, like we were just talking about therapy. Some people wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't want to admit it. So there is still that too. But the one thing I wanted to talk about that I can't yell at you about is there was actually a really interesting element of the book that you should discuss, which is the objective history of psychiatry. And I've forgotten the woman's name, who at the very beginning of the book attempted to revolutionize the concept of an asylum. And
Dorothea Dix.
Yeah. So if you talk a little bit about how you put those nuggets of information in the history of what you're discussing, throughout the book.
Are you talking about the kind of, so the structure of the chapters, which are kind of bookended? Yeah. I mean, there's, one thing writing about the history of psychiatry is there's kind of no shortage of compelling anecdotes. I mean, it's a fascinating history, and really that history, we could talk about what my personal reasons for writing the book might be, but the history itself is I think just fascinating. And so what each chapter is kind of bookended by, the kind of promise, and it leads with the promise of the new kind of era of psychiatry, and then kind of ends with the failure of that era, right? And so the first chapter that you're alluding to begins with the story of Dorothea Dix, who's a fascinating figure who is a woman living in the 19th century, kind of had a rough childhood, a little ambiguous. The kind of historical record is murky, but is initially a school teacher, and then gets a little bit of kind of cultural prominence in writing a kind of book on school reform. And kind of it's heading in that direction, right? This is early 19th century, roles for women are highly circumscribed. Education is kind of one field. She has a nervous breakdown and somehow gets sent to England to kind of live in the estate of a rich family. That rich family has connections to William Tuke or Samuel Tuke. I can't remember which is the father Tuke and the son Tuke, but regardless, who is a Quaker in England, who is the kind of considered one of the founders of the early asylum. And Dorothea gets better and then goes back to the United States and does something quite unusual and unexpected, basically barnstorms throughout the whole country, advocating for the creation of the asylums, and in doing so, really illuminates the suffering of those who we would think of today as having severe mental illness, and advocating for what I think was at least in theory, a very humane, positive reform. Now that doesn't play out, doesn't work out. And then the kind of concluding anecdote is about how these asylums become kind of overrun, and their kind of original intent gets undermined by this kind of sheer demand. And so this kind of structure maintains throughout the whole book.
Okay. So we've been talking for about an hour. So let's conclude by, let me ask you this, and again, kind of trying to paint you into a corner.
I'm good at squirreling my way out.
You are. So at the conclusion, I don't see this, well, I kind of can envision it, this light at the end of the tunnel. Why don't you tell me how, if you can, if there's anything that you can be optimistic about as far as the future of psychiatry and reaching a point where it's no longer basically ignorant?
So the context of my answer is informed by my current research, which is looking at kind of on the ground people who work in the community mental health system here in Albuquerque. And like many communities, that system is fractured, under-resourced, really under severe strain. And so with that said, right, I think it's far too early to make any, and I say this in the book, make any firm claims about the direction of neuroscience in all of this. I think it would be dishonest of me to kind of wave my hand and dismiss what's going on in neuroscience. I will not dismiss, but be very critical in the way that neuroscience is often portrayed in the media, because I think, you know, compelling news stories tend to hype and push beyond what where the science is at. But I'll, you know, this might seem like a kind of squirrely my way out of it. I'll reserve judgment on neuroscience. What I will say, and what I do see is a major problem that I don't know if there's a whole lot of hope, is in the treatment and really caretaking of individuals with severe and persistent mental illness in our society. Now, that is in part a failure of psychiatry, but I would argue that psychiatry is not the majority of that failure, right? That's a failure of a lack of social safety net. That's a failure of systematically underfunding and defunding community mental health organizations. That's a failure of imagination, right? There are compelling models for community-based treatments out there. They're difficult to scale, right? But they are out there. And so is that a hopeful future? Right? Is it a doom and gloom future? No, but I will point out that, you know, one of my concerns with neuroscience today is I'm seeing a lot of the same rhetoric that I've seen. Now, history doesn't need to repeat, right? This could be the time, right?
Yes.
But my unease comes with the kind of hype that I'm seeing around neuroscience among psychiatrists in terms of it being the solution. Because we saw that merely 10 years ago with genetic science. And now psychiatrists have decided genetics is way too complicated, right? That the idea that we would find genes for X mental disorder, right? That's not going to work. We got epigenetics. It's too muddled, right? So now neuroscience is going to save us. The discourse makes me a bit squeamish.
Boy, I started, you know, something you could go on for another 2 hours about. Okay, let's end it, but I'm going to end it by going back to my bookstore. And I've said this many times on the show. This book, you know, we have several book clubs, one nonfiction, one kind of popular science, which maybe I would dump this one into. And if it goes to a book club, which I've said before, I call Fight Club, because if it's around a big table, you're going to have one side and another side. And I always think they're going to kind of like reach, you know, eventually reach across. And this is the kind of book that does that. And that's exactly what we've done today. And I think, personally, I think it's great. Yeah.
I mean, I think, look, I mean, if you're a scholar like me, right, who, you know, as you pointed out, points out the ignorance of others, right, you also have to, and insist those others approach their research or their practice with a degree of humility. You have to do so the same, otherwise you'll be a hypocrite, right? And so part of acknowledging one's own ignorance, right? We could use this in our politics, but part of recognizing one's own ignorance is saying, I don't know anything. The only way I'm going to kind of push myself is by having hard conversations. That's why I said, if someone reads the book and they disagree with everything, it doesn't push the ball forward in any kind of way.
Exactly. And although there are many other fine reasons to read it, I think that's the best explanation that together we've come up with to justify what you've done. And I mean that in the best of all senses, is that it's just like arguing with someone about the Second Amendment or abortion or the death penalty. If most people in America, the reason we're polarized is because no one hears the words the other person is saying. And I think the fact that we have goes a long way. Yeah, I mean, I think
it's central to, it's central to the kind of most noble intent of the academy, I should say, right, is to have these kind of difficult academic freedom. It's not about being exposed to ideas that you agree with or disagree with. It's actually being exposed to ideas that you might find reprehensible and being willing to kind of create a space to kind of talk those things out. Doesn't always work. It's quite difficult to do in practice. It's hard to divorce one's political commitments, moral commitments, emotionality. But it is what it is.
It's exactly what you said. Yeah, it's exactly the opposite.
It provides the energy, right? And it's what kind of pushes things forward.
Right, and it's exactly the opposite of what happens in Congress, as you alluded to earlier.
Yes, I will say, living through the past, the kind of past 5 years, both with the epidemic, right? I mean, it's like ignorance, and I very much share in that ignorance, and it's distressing to live through.
Can we stop now?
Yes, we can stop now.
Because otherwise, we could just plus I'll be very upset. And anyway, thanks so much for coming by the bookstore 10 years ago. Come by again, and maybe you can come by and do a signing. It would work. Definitely would.
Yeah, I think I'm scheduled for a conference. Who knows if it'll happen in Philadelphia? I think in November. So I might drop you a line, and if nothing else, I do when I go to cities. Unfortunately, Albuquerque, not a good city for independent bookstores, but we have a couple of them. But I'm always, Yeah,
well, if you come by, either we could do a signing or something, or we just have a drink or something.
Perfect. A beer. We can pick this up over over beers.
Which is a good place to do it. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. And yeah, have a good one.
Okay, you too. See ya.